Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs at VCU, welcome to the March presentation of the Wilder School Lunch and Learn series, Virginians Opinions, Insights from the Wilder School Commonwealth Poll with Dr. Robin McDougle and Dean Susan Gooden. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Wilder School hosts monthly free virtual events like this one. Each session features change agents, thought leaders, and policymakers who provide insights and commentary on relevant topics of the day. None more relevant than the topic we'll be discussing today. My name is Stephen Dozier, and I'm the Wilder School Senior Director of Development. Before we get started, I'm going to share a few quick announcements. First and foremost, the Wilder School remains at the forefront of our field and continues to rise in the rankings. U.S. News and World Report ranks our school in the top 15% of more than 250 schools worldwide. Nationwide, soon to be worldwide. And we hold top 40 rankings in the 4 program specialties that you see here. The January 2024 Wilder School Commonwealth Poll is now available. The poll provides policymakers with an up-to-date snapshot of public opinion on current policy issues in the Commonwealth. Check it out today. Our fall 2024 graduate application deadline is April 1st. For all of our master's programs except Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness, which is May 24th. Please visit our application site or share the link with colleagues, friends, or family who might be interested. Last but certainly not least, Wilder School Spring 2024 commencement will be at 5:30 p.m. on Saturday, May 11th. In Exhibit Hall A at the Greater Richmond Convention Center. Save the date and contact us for more information. Please see the chat for updates and more links. And now, without further ado, I present our esteemed Dean, Dr. Susan Gooden, who will introduce our speaker and be the moderator for today's session.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and welcome everyone. Appreciate you taking time to join us for today's Lunch and Learn. We're excited to learn a lot more about the Commonwealth Poll. Stephen shared with you that graduation is coming up in a couple of months here in the Wilder School and at many universities across the nation. So the academic year might be ending, but the political season is just beginning. And so the Commonwealth Poll is a wonderful source, a well-respected source of information that we're going to learn more about today from Robin McDougle. Dr. McDougle is a faculty member in the Wilder School and has been a faculty member since 2004. She is now our Associate Dean of Research and Outreach, and many of the signature programs that many of you know and send participants to, or maybe graduates of yourself, fall under Dr. McDougle's portfolio. So programs like our Virginia Executive Institute, our Gracie Harris Leadership Institute, Higher Ground, our Research Institute for Social Equity, all of those institutes, our RVA Eviction Lab, all of those are under Dr. McDougle's portfolio. So a lot of her work and her guidance is well respected by her colleagues and in the community. So I am delighted that Dr. McDougle is going to share with us information from our Commonwealth poll, which we're very proud to say is a CNN recognized poll that happened under Dr. McDougle's leadership. And Dr. McDougle is also an associate professor in our criminal justice program. I think you will learn from today's Commonwealth poll that there are many, many issues that Virginians have opinions about. Virginia is such an important state when we think about elections. As our governor, Governor Wilder would say, it's not a red state, it's not a blue state, but Virginia is a people state. And so Robin is here to share with us some of the opinions from Virginians as the people. Dr. McDougle?
Thank you so much, Dean Gooden. And as Dean Gooden said, it's my honor and privilege to talk to you about the Wilder School's 20th, the Commonwealth Poll, which truly has been a bellwether for over 20 years here in Virginia. So just want to highlight today some of our findings from our 2023 time in the poll and the field. You'll see we have 3 poll points when we were in the field in the summer of 2023, when we were in the field in the fall of 2023, and then when we were in the field right in early January of 2024, to tell you what those people, as Governor Wilder refers to, that Virginia is made up of, really do think about policy issues facing the Commonwealth. So next slide, excuse me. So what are the key issues facing Virginians? Next slide. We first of all look at, when you talk to policymakers, they want to know, are the people that you're polling actually voting? Because that really does have an impact. And what we find is over 76% of our respondents that participated in our poll actually did vote in November's election. So really important voices for policymakers to hear. Next slide. So what got people to vote on election day in November? You will see that the #1 reason is around reproductive rights, followed by education, inflation, and then immigration and crime tied for #4. Interestingly enough, you'll see maintaining democracy and civility as 0. And the reason we put that in there is about 3 years ago, you would have seen that show at about 32%. So it really does show that citizens' views around important issues, taking them to the ballot box, do vary over time based on what they're seeing in the Commonwealth and around the country. Next slide, please. So what about when it comes to the General Assembly? So we know they voted. The #1 reason to vote in November was reproductive rights. What about what they expect the General Assembly members? If you remember, we were right in the field right before the General Assembly session started. What do they want to see the General Assembly focus on? In this case now, you see inflation as the #1 criteria of what they want to see happen during that past 60-day session that we saw in the General Assembly. Once again, followed second by education. Reproductive rights moved to #3 in what they hope the General Assembly addresses. Immigration and crime coming in 4 and 5 in that scenario. Once again, maintaining democracy and civility, holding it 0 there for what we expect the General Assembly to do in session. Next slide, please. So let's talk about that #1 reason of what we wanted the General Assembly to look at during this legislative session. 36% of Virginians said that inflation, or the rising cost of living, is the most important issue facing Virginians. So who are those people that make up that 36%? Next slide. We see that they are men, white and Asian individuals that identify as Republican and Democrat, and those age 65 or older. So when you think about those bills that went through the General Assembly session, or what the legislature is speaking about and what the governor is speaking about around cost of living, around tax burdens, this is what we're trying to address in that aspect of inflation. Next slide. So the second issue that we saw in both reasons that people went to the ballot box in November and what they expected the General Assembly to address during this General Assembly session is consistently education. And we're going to break education into higher education and K-12 because we ask questions about both. So when we look at higher education, this slide is extremely important, and we did some comparisons for you. The question is, do you agree or disagree that the cost of a 4-year degree in an in-state college in Virginia is worth it? Is that return on investment? You will see in January of 23, only 38% of people who were surveyed said, yes, it is worth the cost. We saw that go up slightly in August to 47%, but once again decreased to 39% in January. Why this is so troubling for all of us in higher education is because in previous years, prior to 2023, we never saw a number go less than about 60% when we said, yes, it's worth the cost. Over 60% of Virginians continually said 4-year degrees are worth the cost. But now we're starting to consistently see people questioning what is occurring in 4-year institutions and what are they getting for their cost of tuition, and they're starting to question the value of it. It's very, very important conversation point and policy point for Virginia. Next slide, please. So when you look at who thinks the cost of education is worth it, Democrats Individuals making more than $150,000 a year, 55%, compared to only 21% of those individuals making less than $20,000 a year. So potentially an individual that you would think would be interested in going to college to get a degree. Individuals 65 and older, 51%, but this is extremely important. Only 15% of individuals 18 to 24 think that the cost of college in Virginia is worth it. And that's our direct demographic that we're targeting in undergraduate institutions in the Commonwealth. So once again, a really shocking and important finding from the poll. Next slide. So you look at, is it education in general? People don't think we needed any higher education, and the answer is no. When we ask them, what would you like to see happen? We see that they want to see the cost of education decrease, but look at number 2 here. 63% of our respondents would like to see free community college for all students. They see the value in what our community college systems are offering and how they're offering that information. So there's a lot to be learned from our 4-year institutions here in Virginia about what our 2-year institutions are doing, because they seem to be doing it very well and marketing it very effectively to the community. Next slide, please. Now, it is always important to look at what we're doing, because one of the things we say in higher education is we're preparing that workforce. Consistently, we only went down slightly when you look at 2018 to 2023. 55% of our respondents said that higher education is preparing students for the workforce. And then if you look at the graph to your right, you'll see where we see that breakdown in the skills that we're offering. Important to note, we say higher education as a whole here, not 4-year versus 2-year institutions in this question. So I think that our 4-year institutions get the enjoyment of potentially an increase in overall impact on the workforce from one of those positive outcomes of the 2-year institutions. Next slide, please. Now, when we think about higher education, one of the questions we did ask in this past winter's poll is about the VCU health deal that has occurred here in the city of Richmond, about the dental building that VCU was looking to build and the $100 million deficit that it resulted in. So we had a clarifying question that asked, are you familiar with the VCU health deal? If individuals said yes, they are, we then asked them these 3 questions. Number 1, should the VCU Health Board explain more about the development deal to taxpayers? You'll see 92% of the respondents say they should. That's an enormously high response rate for any kind of polling question, even with a clarifying question. Do you think that Governor Youngkin has had the state appropriately investigate the VCU health systems deal? Only about 37% of individuals saw that as an appropriate investigation and an analysis of what's occurring. And most importantly, here on the 3rd question, do you think that there's been information about the VCU health system deal that has been concealed or kept from the public? Over 50% of our respondents that were familiar with the VCU health deal felt that there was information hidden or kept from the public. So this is an important question when we think about the overall views that we see in the Commonwealth around higher education and those questions around cost and return on investment. Next slide. So now switching gears, but staying within the education space, K-12 education, and looking at what citizens see and think about with regards to K-12 education. Really important. Post-COVID, we're looking continually still at that learning loss and on grade level. So comparing our January 22 findings to where we are in January of 23, and looking at asking, are citizens, students in your community ahead, on track, or behind their peers? You will see we've made great strides in the Commonwealth, from 3% to 13% in ahead, from 13% to 24% on track, and then from 79% falling behind to reducing that to 43%. But please do realize here that that means that over 40% of our Virginians think that kids in K-12 school are still behind grade level. So there's still a significant amount of work that needs to be done in addressing the learning loss that was as a result of COVID and seems to be sustaining and not being overcome. Next slide. We also then talked about transgender questions, something that we're seeing around the Commonwealth. being discussed in school boards and with legislators. So we asked the question around, should transgender students be allowed to use a bathroom corresponding with a different gender than their birth sex? Seeing 35% of the respondents said yes, while 60% said no. Participants, should transgender students be allowed to participate on a sports team corresponding with a different gender than their birth sex? Once again, seeing 26% of the respondents saying yes, 66% of the respondents saying no. Next slide. Another big issue facing K-12 and in school boards and communities is around banning of books. And we actually just saw Governor Youngkin veto a bill just last week around this issue. The question we asked in January, within our public schools, should any parents be allowed to object to the presence of any book in the school's library and have that book removed? We see that over 30% of our respondents say yes, but over 60% of the respondents, 65% say no. Parents should not be allowed to pick what books can and cannot be in their child's public school library. Next slide, please. So if you remember, reproductive rights was the #1 reason that people went to the ballot box, but the #3 issue that they wanted to see addressed in the Commonwealth during the General Assembly session. We looked at the bill, the constitutional amendment that was passed in Ohio in 2023, giving every individual the right to make and carry out one's own reproductive decisions. So next slide. We asked the question, do you support a similar ballot measure in Virginia to give all citizens the right to control their reproductive rights? We see that over half, 57% of respondents say that yes, they would support such a ballot measure, which would be a change to the Virginia Constitution here in Virginia. Next slide. We will see that this past year, one of the biggest pieces of legislation that Democrats ran on in the election cycle was around the constitutional amendment of freedom of reproductive rights. We saw HJ1, House Bill 1, go in, which would have been a constitutional amendment to provide the fundamental rights to reproductive freedom to all individuals. The outcome of this bill is that they got it continued to 2025. I point that out as not a kick the can down the lane decision, but that in Virginia, when we make a constitutional amendment change, we need to have it occur in an election in the General Assembly. So it needs to be voted on during the General Assembly session, immediately followed by an election, which would be in 2026. And then a second General Assembly session. So by moving it to 2025, it aligned more clearly with what the criteria are to put forth a constitutional amendment in Virginia to change the Constitution. Perspectives on public safety, as you remember, were right down there in the 4th, consistent both on the reason you voted and on what you wanted the General Assembly to look at. And this probably explains why we see it #4. Pretty much split in between when we ask, is crime a serious problem in your community? 49% agree, 49% disagree. But the issues that we see in public safety, next slide, please, are looking at who sees this as the biggest issue. So women, Black and African American and Asian individuals, and individuals over the age of 55. Next slide. So we then kind of delved into what issues did we see that are relevant in this past General Assembly session. So what did we ask in 2024? In January, we asked, do you agree or disagree with increasing penalties for drug dealers found guilty of dealing opiates when the drug led to a death of an overdose? Over 80% of the respondents agree that this individual should receive increased penalties as a drug dealer. Interestingly enough, a bill was put into session and actually died in the Senate Courts Committee that proposed this. So an interesting comparison between where citizens' views are, yet where legislation went forward, or in this case, didn't. Next slide. What we did see, though, come out of this General Assembly session tied to opiate use was around House Bill 1504, which actually had an emergency clause in it, made it effective March 1st. An emergency clause meaning the House and Senate both passed the bill. It went to the governor for immediate signing. When he signed it, it immediately went into law. This bill requires school boards of education to establish guidelines to communicate overdose responses, and parental notification. So it's around the idea of parents in school divisions need to be notified if there is an overdose that occurs in that school division. So there was a link of a piece of policy that did pass this year tied both to K-12 education and opiate use that we saw as both important issues that citizens are talking about in the Commonwealth. Next slide has to do with marijuana legalization. So we had a question that said, do you agree or disagree with Virginia lawmakers legalizing the retail sale of marijuana? We are still in Virginia, not in a retail sale legalization space. We see over half agree that that should be legalized. And then should Virginia lawmakers regulate the sale of marijuana and make it taxable, just like we do the ABC Commission or other taxable components within the Commonwealth? Over 80% of Virginians say that that should be created and taxed. House Bill 698, Senate Comparison Bill, Companion Bill 640, Senate Bill 448, both established this framework for the creation of a marijuana market, passed the House and Senate, and is sitting at the governor's office for him to make a decision on by April 8th. So we shall see what the governor's decision is around that retail space. All right, gun violence, it's something we talked a lot about. There was a lot of conversation with both the House and the Senate being controlled by Democrats to see if we were going to see increased gun legislation this past year through the General Assembly, and I think you'll see we did. We did ask the question about what can government most effectively do to respond to gun violence in the U.S. See, 40% of individuals talk about mental health services, while 43% of individuals talk about restriction of who can own a gun. So if you look at those responses of citizens, and next slide, please. Look at the bills that came through this General Assembly session. You will see House Bill 2 around assault firearms and prohibiting the sale of assault firearms and purchase and transfer. House Bill 175, carrying in public areas of assault firearms, all of these making these prohibited with a penalty associated. House Bill 1195, firearms during waiting period for purchase, increasing the waiting period for firearms for purchase. And then one that people probably saw a lot in the news here in Virginia based on the unfortunate and horrific events that happened in Newport News with the young man who took the gun and shot his teacher, Senate Bill 44, which has to do with parents receiving penalties if they have not fairly and securely locked their firearm and their child uses that firearm in the commission of a crime, hurting or injuring someone. All of these bills have passed the House and Senate, are sitting in the governor's office for his decision. We're expecting a lot of these to be vetoed by Governor Youngkin based on some of the things he said, but we've not seen full outcomes of the bills. I will say the Senate Bill 44, the parents bill, he's got till April 8th to do that. That's one that's gotten a little bit more of attention and potentially some positive traction in that space. Next slide. So voting intentions, as we finish up, we know we're going into the voting season. We had Super Tuesday here in Virginia just a couple of weeks ago. We, of course, always ask if it's a presidential election, who are you going to vote for? Interestingly enough, we see that consistently in the summer and in our January election, it is flat out in the margin of error if Joe Biden and Donald Trump are the candidates for president, which clearly they both have won their nominations effective late last week. So they will be the nominees in Virginia as early January. That ended up 40% of Virginians would vote for Donald Trump. 43% of Virginians would vote for Joe Biden. Our margin of error in both of those polls range from about 4.8 to 5, so very much in the margin of error. So just as Governor Wilder always says, Virginia is a people state. It is a people state that will have a significant amount of attention both in the presidential election and remembering that the year after the presidential election here in Virginia, we will have a gubernatorial election, which will continue to keep the focus on what Virginians think about all policy issues and how that impacts how they're and who they're voting for here in the Commonwealth. So with that, I will turn it back to Dean Gooden for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDougle. Really appreciate that robust and informative presentation, sharing with us opinions from Virginians on a variety of issues. And I encourage people to please submit their questions either into the chat or into Q&A. We've got time for questions. I'm going to kick it off by asking, one of the things that struck me is that, as your data suggests, opinions of Virginians in many cases will vary dramatically, even within a few months. So one of the things I know we hope to do with our Commonwealth poll is to inform policymakers. But how do we connect policy with opinion when opinion is shifting very quickly? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, and it is a really good question, and you really do see it. That's why I thought that was so interesting to show why you voted in November, and then literally just a few months later, what you want the General Assembly to do. I think there are two aspects about that. I think actually citizens in Virginia are much more in tune with and watching what's going on. So I do think there's some thoughts when we look at that reproductive right question. When voting happened in November, if there was a belief that reproductive rights were important and you wanted to see Democrats in control, that happened in the General Assembly session. So they moved that thought to say, okay, now what can you do in power and other issues that are important to me? So that shows a very educated citizenry around issues. I think we also, though, sometimes suffer in Virginia being so close to DC. Federal issues impact decision-making and thoughts, even if they don't directly impact things we're doing in Virginia. So I do think that those two things come into play. How we address it is a challenge. There's always a balance between education and polling and too much information. I will say that one of the things I'm so very proud of in the Commonwealth poll is we've continued to hold the gold standard of methodology when we do our polling. And it's expensive to do it that way, but it's important to do it that way. So I think one of the things that we can continue to do is continue to poll like we are polling and continue to get that information out and explain why the way in which we poll really does, that methodology is important to really see what's going on. But I also think the other thing we've got to remember too is that we don't always oversample. And so sometimes voices, especially underrepresented voices in rural areas of Virginia, are we making sure those voices are regularly being heard? And that's something we're always talking about. And that's where that methodology is important. But we are educated, we are informed, but we're also impacted. And so I think that that's why you see this variation. And what people see is important. I don't think they're fickle. I think they're making those decisions based on the information they're getting.
Great. Sounds like they're informed and they're keeping up, and they are, making and then shifting opinions as they go along, which is important. So we have you walked into the next set of questions, which is, for those who are not as familiar with the Commonwealth poll, can you kind of walk us through how you sample, how, you talked about from different regions of the state. I know this is a telephone poll, so, how do you get people on the phone, and are you concerned that there's a bias there? So can you just walk us through a bit, sort of give us the poll methodology 101?
So the professor in me loves to talk about methodology, right? So, but yes, what you talked about, Dean Gooden, is exactly what we do. But so we create and develop a sample that is truly representative of the citizens of the Commonwealth, and we weight that sample to be representative based on what census data shows us, and continually updating census data. But you mentioned we do phone calls, but we do that via telephone landline, which sometimes people think is crazy that we still do, but there are big parts of this state that individuals don't have good cell phone service, or there are certain demographics that you would ignore if you only called by cell phone. On the flip side, we have about 75% of our population we access through cell phones. But in both of those cases, we actually have real human beings doing the survey with you. And that's really important. We're not texting you survey questions. We're not doing that. So that when you have questions or clarifying questions, there's a person to take you through that. So that's a part of our methodology. So a sample that is weighted, based on what the demographics of the Commonwealth look like, and we keep sampling until we hit those. Also a sample that is representative of the regions of the Commonwealth. So we have the state broken out into 5 regions, and we make sure our sample comes from all of those regions. We overlay that with using both landline and cell phone with actual humans calling you and asking you the questions. So that's an important level of methodology. And then on top of all of that, we do a 2-factor system to make sure that when you call Robin McDougle, even though her cell phone number is from Fredericksburg, because that's where she grew up and she was 18 when she got her cell phone, she actually lives in Hanover, and that is where she resides. And so we make sure that she's in the right region. The reason that's really important is it's expensive to do that 2-factor check, but it's extremely important when we really, because we break our results down by regions of the Commonwealth. And I want to make sure that Robin McDougle is in Richmond Central and not in Northern Virginia. And if I don't do that 2-factor check, I could put her results in the wrong place. And so those are some of the ways in which we go about. And then, of course, always giving our margin of error. We put that right up front. In allowing that to be seen pretty clearly. But that's sort of how we create our sample, and we follow that exact same methodology every single time. So that's why I can compare August of 23 to January of 24, because my methods have been exactly the same. Even though the individuals are different, the methods to get them are the same.
And while we're talking about methodology, you know, we shared at the beginning that the Commonwealth Poll is a CNN designated poll for the Commonwealth of Virginia in elections. Can you talk a bit about that process? I mean, I know that that was very laborious and intense, very high standards there. Can you say a bit about that relative to methodology?
Yes, and that's really why we were selected. So when CNN reached out to us, they reached out to several folks that do political polling, and we had to provide them 5 years, 10 polls worth of our methodology, including the raw data for them to analyze to make sure they got exactly where we got as well. The entire process was around how rigorous we are in getting our sample, how rigorous, how our questions are written. So, you know, there are a lot of political polls out there that are written for candidates that lean people one way or the other. And those, you know, those push polls are really important for political candidates. That's not what we do. We're not bipartisan, we're nonpartisan in the Commonwealth Poll. And so they reviewed just poll and poll and poll, question and question and question, making sure the way our questions have been written over time and how we continue to write our poll questions are neutral, as we like to say. We're not leading a respondent one way or the other, that they're methodologically sound. When we can, we model questions that we see in national polls, so we can see where Virginia is doing in comparison to a poll that Pew put out. So, you know, when I talk about the cost of education for 4-year institutions in Virginia, there's actually national data that the Pew Foundation has done that's seen similar results around the country in the last 2 years. And I can give those comparisons because we try to write questions that model when we can those. So that entire process, which took us literally about 4 months, throughout the process, many, you know, we started with simple questions and simple requests, and they went more and more and more, and then questions to myself, questions to the firm we used. We use a great firm that does all of our calling. We don't have a call center at VCU. We don't, that's not how we do that. We utilize a call center here in Virginia though. So they made sure that that call center was, you know, that they held the same methods and the same standards, which they do. So it was all tied, Dean Gooden, to our methods and our standards and our consistency across historically, and what they saw in those most recent polls when we were in 2020. So it was rigorous methods to learn, you know, for them to meet their standard, and we're very proud of it.
No, as you should be. And another question, sort of in the same genre, is about how you end up selecting the topics and the questions. So there's a plethora of topics out here, and one of our attendees also wanted to know, you know, do members of the General Assembly have any voice in terms of questions that are selected? Do they get any special status? So how do you select those questions and topics?
That's probably the number one question we always get. And so we start where we are at home, which is the Wilder School. We have amazing faculty within the Wilder School who are looking at policy issues on a regular basis. And so regularly we ask faculty of if they are interested in submitting questions. So we've had questions on environmental justice that align with our Institute for Sustainable Energy and Environment. Questions on social equity that come from our Research Institute for Social Equity, questions in criminal justice that come from our Homeland Security and Criminal Justice faculty. So we get questions from our faculty. Just because a faculty member submits a question doesn't mean it always makes it into the pool, but that's where we start. And then we look at the questions that are facing the Commonwealth. So if it's an election season, what are we seeing in the media? What are we seeing legislators talk about? If it's a gubernatorial election, what are the candidates talking about? What topics are they talking about? What topics are in the news? And then I would be remiss if I didn't talk about our true guiding force in the Commonwealth Poll, which is Governor L. Douglas Wilder. He has been the absolute wonderful guiding leader of the Commonwealth Poll, someone who truly has his finger on the pulse of the citizens of the Commonwealth all of the time. So when we get this group of questions and topics together, we work with Governor Wilder, we get his guidance and his feedback. And as always, he will always have a question that never crossed my mind that usually ends up being one of the top questions that the media gloms onto in a poll release. But we go in that way and we get those questions. But then to talk about policymakers, I don't want to just talk about legislators. I want to talk about policymakers as a whole. I take the opportunity and the privilege to present the poll in as many places as we're asked. And in the past, we have been regularly invited to the House Education Committee and the Senate Education and Health Committee to present the Commonwealth Poll findings every year. Literally, that's what they're asking us to do. And so during that time, I also take advantage of the fact that I have members of the General Assembly in front of me, and I say, what issues are you interested in? And we make sure that we collect those issues. Sometimes they make it into our poll. Sometimes they're really, really specific to their locality and really don't kind of cover the breadth of what we think about with the Commonwealth. But we take advantage of that. Similarly, I get the honor and privilege of presenting the poll in Chev to the college presidents. And so I take their questions on and their areas of interest. So anytime I have the opportunity to present to policymakers, I'm always going to give them the opportunity to say, what questions are you interested in? Because in my mind, the more questions I can put together that we can start to go field our way through, work with Governor Wilder's leadership to put out there, the more informed our poll is for both citizenry and policymakers, because we want them to use these results and help inform their thoughts, their ideas, the legislation they're looking to put forward, or even the legislation they're looking to vote on. So yes, I think of it as an open door policy. It doesn't mean that because it comes in that it makes it into the poll, but it might make it into the poll in the summer, and I might have gotten it in January. So we never get rid of those questions. We always look at, and then we also always have questions that we consistently try, like you saw the higher ed question, right? We can show trends, and we've created, Brittany Keegan, Dr. Keegan in our office has done an amazing job of creating a data dictionary that has all of the data from all of our past polls, all of the data described, and allows for it to be utilized effectively for research for our graduate students, for our faculty, and in the classroom as well. So it's important for us to have some of that consistent questioning as well.
Great. And then I think the last question about the methodology, unless others come up, we'll then shift to some of the findings that you talked about. And I think some folks want to go deeper there. But what's your response rate? What are the response rates like for the poll? And do you find that they differ, based on different geographical locations within the Commonwealth?
So, we're always going to hit that 800 to 815 number. That's what we really, until the population pops up a little bit more here in the Commonwealth, that hits us that that representative sample. Our response rates, we try to be very strategic. And when we go in the field so that people don't have polling fatigue, so you're not going to see me slide right out in the field right after a November election because we've all been polled to death. We try to pick that time. Our response rates are higher because we use phones than you do with text messaging and those kinds of things. Generally speaking, we see a response rate that matches the gold standard of opinion polling. But where we do allow variation, of course, is you'll see a student and an individual might answer 15 of 18 questions, but they're not going to answer a couple, and we don't drop them off. So some standards would say, well, you drop them off if they're not a complete answer. No, we don't do that. We do capture the questions they answer. And then we, of course, make sure that, so you'll see sometimes variation in response rates by questions. There are certain questions either people don't see relevant to them, or they don't feel comfortable answering to someone that they do not know. Depending, sometimes you see that on some public safety questions, especially personal safety. They don't feel comfortable answering that on the, to someone they don't know. So that might impact response rate as well. We saw that a lot, Dean Gooden, as you know, we did a lot of COVID vaccine polling, and we would see when you started asking people if they were vaccinated, as it became more normalized, they became more comfortable in answering that. And you start to see response rates increase. But when we first started, people were very uncomfortable with talking about that.
Great. All right, well, if we get into some of the more specific areas, and you certainly gave us a lot to chew on. If we look at the area of higher education in particular, so, a figure that really popped out is that only 15% of those 18 to 24-year-olds think the cost of college is worth it. But we see that those 65 and above think that the cost of college is worth it. So in many cases, and we know there are a lot of students who are not traditionally aged, they might be much older than that, but you could have kids, young adults, 18 to 24, saying it's not worth it. Their parents being like, well, I still think maybe so. And their grandparents being like, it's absolutely worth it. And perhaps there's financial support or persuasion that comes with that. So what do you think that says over time as society continues to age? Do you think this is something that sort of naturally people appreciate as they get older? Or are we seeing a shift potentially in the role and value of higher education?
I think hands down, we're seeing a shift. It's very interesting to me, this concept, even 5 to 7, when I told you 5 years ago, we never, and it's true, we never saw that number less than 60% in Virginia across age groups. 18 to 24-year-olds, we're in a space now, they're not going to age into thinking education, higher education is where they're starting to question the dynamic. They're starting to question, is it needed? I think clearly COVID brought about some of those questions, right? It was this unfortunate natural experiment of all of a sudden higher education went online. We didn't know what that meant. Then parents started saying, do you really need it? Those parents in between, like not those grandparents, but those parents. And now we're post-COVID, people are back, but people are really starting to say, what is the value for what I'm getting? That's why I pointed out that 63% for the community colleges. Because if you look at how Virginia's community college system has looked at retooling, as they call it, or retasking, looked at certifications, looked at how they're looking at various aspects of their role, the traditional 2-year associate's degree role and the role to task and skill people on the skills they need to move into to a certain career. That is resonating. So it's not necessarily that you leave high school and you have everything you need. The question becomes, what are we doing in our 4-year institutions? And we've got to make a different argument. Our market our return on investment, and our argument now to parents, and most importantly to the kids. It used to be the kids would say, of course I want to go to college, of course I want to go to college, and mom and dad would say, I'll figure out how to pay for it, or you're going to have to figure out how to pay for it. That 18 to 24-year-old group is not saying, of course I'll go to college anymore. And I don't think that's going to change in the near future. We have to do a better job in four-year institutions following the path of what our community college colleagues have done in making an argument for what we're doing to prepare students for careers in the workforce. That's my opinion. And I think and my opinion based on our Commonwealth Poll data, for years and years, we saw those high numbers. COVID happened, and it wasn't just a blip. If I had just said in 2023, we saw 37%, but then it popped back up to 50, but it continues. And if you notice, and I really do think it happens to be, we're in the field in January when people are home, they get their tuition bill for the spring, and they get their, their grades home from the fall. If you notice, both in January and both times, you see that peak go down. In the summer, you saw it go up. People are excited maybe to go to college. There's a little bit of that carry forward, but after a semester, that question kind of happens again. We're gonna keep seeing this pattern. We've got to do something different in higher education.
Yeah, you make some important points, Dr. McDougle, and I think, in many ways it's been, we're witnessing the perfect storm in higher education with COVID-19 and the price. And then, of course, the more recent news of the delayed of the FAFSA, the financial aid form, which is going to dramatically impact students being able to enroll in the fall because of the delays with the U.S. Department of Education, which of course disproportionately impacts lower income students who are depending upon the Pell Grant, who are depending upon being able to get those loans. And the massive delays in the rollout are putting many families in Virginia and nationwide. That certainly is not, I think, helping in terms of having more positive opinions about higher education, especially from 18 to 24-year-olds.
I agree completely. And imagine it. So even if you're on that bubble, but I think I'm going to go to college, but it's expensive. But as soon as I get my financial aid package, I'll decide. And I don't get that. I'm gonna continue to go in a different direction. And by the time that they figure the FAFSA process out, whenever they do, I do think it might be too late for those kids who were on the bubble, because they've made a decision now that I couldn't get from USDOE what I needed, from my institution what I needed. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the community college. I'm going to go ahead and go to work for a little while. I'm going to make these different decisions. And 10 years ago, they would have waited. They're not going to wait anymore. And we haven't even hit the cliff, by the way. We haven't hit the age cliff of what we know is going to happen with freshmen coming in. That's also coming very closely to us too. Fewer freshmen coming in when we talk about that age cliff that higher education is facing. And we haven't even gotten that yet as well.
Well, certainly a lot of issues for those of us in higher education to grapple with. If we shift a little bit, we have a participant who's asking about the penalties, for example, for opioid dealings, and wondering if, when the poll is asking questions about particular policy issues, he says, or she says, I feel that, for example, with legislation regarding increased penalties for opioid dealings resulting in fatalities, the existing law is essential to understanding potential changes. So how confident are you that when people are being polled, they necessarily know what the current law is, versus, is this the status quo or is this a proposed change? How do you deal with that issue in the poll?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will tell you, sometimes we actually don't include questions on the poll because the current policy is so complex. We are concerned that it will be understood by the general population. So we do field test our poll and listen to live interviews from live participants so that we get that feel. But to directly answer that question, we actually give a summary of the current policy. So that's why it's so important that person giving, there's a script that the person giving the interview is going to say, currently in Virginia, an individual selling opiates, if someone were to die, they would not be charged with murder. do you support a change in the legislation, or do you support a policy that would do this? So we try to give them a layman's assessment of the current policy, because I agree with our the participant who asked the question. It would never be good to ask if someone should change a policy if I have no idea what the policy is. And I know that we have an educated Commonwealth on polls, but probably people don't walk around like myself and Dean Gooden and some of the others of us in this school with the actual Virginia policy in our mind. So yes, we do give an overview of what the current status is on it, but I do point out that if a current policy is too complex or the change is so nuanced, the question will not include the question in the poll, not because we don't think it's important, but we don't think we get a valid assessment of people's opinions as a result.
Right. We also have a question hitting me more close to home about VCU, and you were talking about the failed deal there. Have there been any updates on the stance from VCU administration regarding the Commonwealth's response to the VCU health development deal?
So specifically to the poll, or are there any changes? So no one has commented on the poll. I feel like the poll really kind of stood for itself, strong methodology, good questions. I haven't heard anything from the university around the deal. The one thing I will say is there was language in the appropriations, the budget bill, as we call it in Virginia, that tied the $25 million that VCU asked in this current General Assembly budget for the new dentistry building is tied to the fact that if VCU receives that money from the state, they cannot use any state dollars to pay the $53 million in the way the language in the I think in the contract was in lieu of taxes to the city of Richmond, but I'll just say the $53 million owed to the city of Richmond. That's actually in the appropriation language that Senator Deeds had that amendment in there that talked specifically about some criteria of what VCU would have to do. They also have to identify a location, which they announced I guess 2 weeks ago. They had to publicly announce where the location would be, but then there was the follow-up piece of appropriation language that says that they cannot use any state dollars to pay the $53 million that they owe the city of Richmond from the previous deal. So Governor Wilder wrote a wonderful Wilder Visions on that last week as well. But it's an interesting kind of appropriations language tied to that. So no response from the university, but I do think it's an interesting legislative component there.
Right. And certainly more interest, I think, that from the media and from the public, which I think your poll, our poll tapped into really well. So kudos there. So this is Women's History Month, and oftentimes we think in terms of elections, in particular national elections, people are curious about what women are interested in and how that might impact results. So for any of these policy topics, did you see any findings that are pronounced from a gender perspective?
So it's really interesting. I'm actually going to start on the contrary to that and say it was really exciting to see the reproductive rights question hold consistently across gender. For so many years, that conversation has been framed in a women-only conversation. And I think that we've seen that now as a person conversation. So that was very positive to see. Where we see it, women having maybe views that rate higher, women usually have education as one of the highest issues if I pull it out just by gender. That education becomes something that's, if you look, women alone is one of the drivers kind of is education, and specifically K-12 education. I'm trying to think of the other kind of questions. Occasionally you see some public safety questions, but once again, I think that public safety is a broad concept. And so we're seeing less and less of historically what my criminal justice colleagues and I would talk about of, women and elderly being the ones that are most fearful of being victims of crime, you know, in comparison. I think you're seeing that narrowing a gap. You did see 65 and older were more fearful, saw crime, not more fearful, saw crime as more of an issue than those under 65, women more than men, but still small numbers in that. I think what's going to be so interesting is a year from now when we see a female candidate based on at least early thoughts as the Democrat nominee in Virginia for governor, how gender is going to play in people's policy thoughts when there's a female candidate running for governor. That's going to be really interesting to see. I'm looking forward to that.
Sounds like a potential prediction for a Spanberger in terms of her.
I mean, at least
nomination.
we haven't polled on that yet, but there have been polls from some of my colleagues around the Commonwealth that I think very highly of that have polled on that. And you know, she's right now, we're 2 years off. Right now, she is leading in double digits pretty heavily, and it definitely has a high financial carry, much higher than Mayor Stoney right now of the money that she's raised. So it should be interesting.
Well, and I think as we wrap up, so any insights, can we get some, you know, early information in terms of the topic of the next poll and when it'll be out?
So we will be back in the field early this summer, and we usually go in June. We will wait to see what happens. One of the things that'll drive some of our questions is what happens with the budget. So remember, you know, we've got a budget that was bipartisanly passed in the House and Senate on time to the governor. The governor has real challenges with the budget. He's talked about that, and how they're going to work that out and what's going to actually come out in questions around that will be something that I think you'll see us asking. We're going to be moving into a presidential election. So we're going to look at what President Biden and former President Trump are talking about as their major issues that relate to Virginia. And you'll see those in our summer poll. You're going to see our higher education questions because we're always going to have them in there because it's a pressing issue for us. So those are some of the topics that we're looking at, generally speaking. But we really, like I truly said, there are not a lot of preconceived ideas. Governor Wilder has been an amazing leader in this space. The people drive the interest and the questions. You've got to listen to the people. And so that's what we're spending now since we were out in the field in January up until when we put our questions together in mid-May to test and get in the field in June. We'll be listening to what the people are talking about.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McDougle. We all learned a lot here. Thank you for sharing so much information and rich information about the Commonwealth Poll. It is a jewel in the crown of the Wilder School, and I think it epitomizes the phrasing of Governor Wilder about how the Wilder School really tries to focus on putting people first as we continue to realize his legacy. So thank you so much. Best of luck as you continue to poll Virginians. We'll be all watching as we move into this electoral season.
Thank you so much for the time and having me today.
And with this, I will toss it back to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Dean Gooden, and thank you, Dr. McDougle. Thank you to our communications team in the background who are working to make this a great program. I agree with one of our comments that came through the Q&A tool. Dr. Robin McDougle is so thorough in her explanation and presentation today, and I think we all come away with a little bit more knowledge, or a lot more knowledge, about the Commonwealth Poll. And so thank you both for a very engaging conversation. And as we look ahead, you know, we are preparing for next month's Lunch and Learn presentation. And in that preparation, we ask, have you ever wondered what former members of Congress do? Former members of Congress, or the FMC, is a bipartisan voluntary alliance of former U.S. senators and representatives who advocate for representative democracy at home and abroad. So I encourage you to save the date for our next Lunch and Learn on April 17th with the president of the Association of the Former Members of Congress and former Congressman L.F. Payne for his title, which is, for his talk, which is titled Former Members of Congress Still at Work. And until then, everybody have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. As always, we look forward to seeing you at our next chat.